Good evening. Welcome. My name is Meg Honey, and I am the co-founder of our local 501c3 nonprofit organization, Rise Up Against Racism. And I would like to welcome you to our virtual Live from the Library program, Showing Up Boldly, the political and organizing history of Black women. I am so happy to be moderating another program for Walnut Creek Library Foundation, and I really hope that we can be in person very soon. I want to kick off tonight by thanking our presenting sponsor, the Simpson family, our masterpiece sponsors, Ray and Kristen Abraham, Mary Ann Haruska, Robin and Arthur Rangel, Mechanics Bank, and Whittier Trust. Classic sponsors, Sharon and James Moore and Sequoia Entities. Our bestseller sponsors are Maria and Mark Brown, Carol and Ken Fowler, and Luella and Ralph Haskew. I'd also like to make sure we recognize our media and print sponsors, Diablo Magazine, the East Bay Times, and Minutemen Press Lafayette. Black women have made significant contributions to political movements, campaigns, and organizations for generations. How do the unique experiences of leaders like Ayanna Pressley, Stacey Abrams, and Kamala Harris connect to those of activists from earlier eras? How can we ensure that our students and the greater citizenry understand and honor this vital history? Tonight, I will host a moderated conversation that explores the historical context and exciting future of Black female leadership. Our program's title, Showing Up Boldly, is inspired by a passage from Stacey Abrams' book, Minority Leader: How to Lead from the Outside and Make Real Change. Black women continue to show up, act boldly, and shape social and political movements in this country. I am looking forward to exploring the many dimensions of this important work tonight with our distinguished panel. Our first panelist is Dimitri Broxton, the Senior Director of Education at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. Mr. Broxton manages school and community outreach, as well as develops educational resources and programs. Dr. Kate Chilton, a lecturer at San Jose State University, is our next panelist. Dr. Chilton focuses her research on urban slavery and emancipation in the District of Columbia, particularly women's interactions with the Freedmen's Bureau. Her articles have been published in the Journal of American History. Our third panelist is Dr. Eula Taylor, who is the professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. Her articles on African American women's history and feminist theory have appeared in numerous academic journals. In 2013, Dr. Taylor received UC Berkeley's Distinguished Professor Teaching Award. If you enjoy tonight's program, please consider making a donation to the Library Foundation to support future programming. You can visit their website, www.wclibrary.org, or donate by clicking on the link in the chat box. Tonight, donations will be matched by my dear friends, Kathleen and John Odney, as well as my mother, Carol Weinstra. Following our panel discussion, we will have a brief Q&A. You can submit your questions for our panel in the Q&A box at any time during tonight's presentation. Without further ado, it is my honor to welcome our panel. Great. Over the last few years, we have witnessed Black women win historic political victories and lead inspiring organization efforts. US Representative Ayanna Pressley defeated the 10-term incumbent Mike Capuano in Massachusetts' primary election and was the first Black woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts. After serving in the Georgia House of Representatives from 2007 to 2017, Stacey Abrams founded Fair Fight Action, an organization to address voter suppression. Her efforts have been widely credited with boosting voter turnout in Georgia, including in the 2020 presidential election, where Joe Biden won the state, and in Georgia's 2020-2021 US Senate election and special election, which gave Democrats control over the Senate. Kamala Harris served as our state's Attorney General and US Senator before becoming the first female vice president and the highest ranking female official in the United States history, as well as the first African American and first Asian American vice president. Dr. Taylor, welcome. Can you connect this work and victories to the long history of Black female leadership and political organizing? Is there a particular moment or era that served as a catalyst for these recent watershed moments?
First of all, thank you for having me here this evening. I'm really excited about our conversation that's going to unfold, because if there was ever a moment, right, to talk about the power of Black women organizing, it is now. Can you connect? Okay, I'm sorry. The chat is throwing me. Okay. I'm going to ignore the chat. Okay. Let me just do that, because I cannot multitask and I want to stay in the moment. And the moment, I think, that in many ways can be linked to igniting this particular happening is Shirley Chisholm's 1972 bid for the presidency of the United States. And I want to talk a little bit about this moment, because in many ways it kind of gets at the complexity of coalition building and how Black women were extremely excited about her presidency, but it didn't take them long to figure out that they alone could not put her in the White House. And so what we see happening during this time period, when Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman elected to the House of Representatives from New York, when Shirley Chisholm decided to run for the presidency in 1972, her candidacy was not supported by many of the white feminist groups. The National Women's Political Caucus did not support her even as a candidate. But what was even more surprising to Chisholm was that she also did not receive much support amongst Black mainstream political men. And this was shocking to her, because she always saw them as allies and partners in the struggle up until this point. But what happened was many of the Black men described her as being captive of the women's movement. And they hinted that she would sell out Black interests if she was in the position to do so, if these interests conflicted with quote, quote, women's interests. So what we see happening is that this statement like shamelessly implies, right, that race is inherently gendered as male, right? And it also constructs Chisholm as a possible race traitor if she dared to critique gendered politics. So Shirley Chisholm is out there on her own in many ways, right? And so she's trying to figure out, wow, I'm not being supported by these white feminist groups. I'm not being supported by these Black men who are also in these mainstream organizations such as the NAACP, the local National Urban League. What am I going to do? And so Shirley Chisholm said, let me tap into Black women's organizing efforts that have long histories. So she tapped into the Black sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Delta Sigma Theta. And in fact, Kamala Harris is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, one of the early Black sororities. She tapped into Black church auxiliaries, were very, very important, where Black women from a range of classes come together and organize and had different auxiliaries. She tapped into those efforts as well. She tried to tap into labor organizing, but was not as successful. In the end, Chisholm realized that it took more for Black women, and Black women needed a national political organization. And in 1973, a cadre of African-American women came together and founded the National Black Feminist Organization. And from this organization, they basically said, we have so many issues that we need to deal with: childcare, housing, access to resources, better schools. So the list went on and on and on. And they tried to organize around these multiple issues. Now, it's in organizing around Shirley Chisholm's campaign that you have people like Barbara Lee. They say they cut their teeth, right, at that particular moment. So you have Black women who now we hold up in a particular kind of way, basically were exposed to certain kind of organizing, coalition building efforts with the Shirley Chisholm campaign. We also see with the Black feminist organization that what became clear is that there were so many issues that pushed Black women into different levels of the economy that made it very, very difficult for them to do more than survive America. And unfortunately, the National Black Feminist Organization, it didn't hold. But what it did do, it spun out other organizations, such as the Third World Women's Alliance, such as Black Women Writers, the Combahee River Collective. So all of these organizations kind of began to spin and twirl during this moment. And I like to anchor it all in Shirley Chisholm's campaign.
Oh, what a great place for us to start. Mr. Broxton, Dr. Chilton, would you like to add or respond to that wonderful opening?
I think Dr. Taylor just brought it home. So
yeah, I think so too. And Dr. Taylor, I think that a lot of what you shared and some of the issues that we're going to be exploring tonight too, Shirley Chisholm's campaign, both kind of aligned with historical elements, sort of the tensions and the very different lived realities between white feminists and Black feminists, the realities that you talked about in terms of going to the places where powerful organizing was happening. I think that there's a lot for us to really consider and think about as we study and learn more about Shirley Chisholm and her campaign and what that meant in the time period in the 1970s, and certainly what it means for us now. So thank you for all of that. As we're talking about Shirley Chisholm's influence and inspiration, we certainly can put our eyes towards women in leadership roles. And in her acceptance speech, then President-elect Kamala Harris honored women who, quote, fought and sacrificed so much for equality, liberty, and justice for all, including the Black women who are too often overlooked, but so often prove that they are the backbone of our democracy. Dr. Chilton, I'm curious how the critical work of Black women is remembered and taught. Can you share with us a little bit about your work to ensure that this important history is centered in history and social studies classrooms?
Yes, and thank you. I want to echo Dr. Taylor in thanking you guys for inviting us all here this evening for what promises to be a really fascinating conversation. So like Meg, I have a history with San Jose State University. I teach there, and this semester I've had the privilege and also slightly the challenge, because we've been completely online, of course, this year, of teaching a class on the history of the civil rights movement. So these questions that you were just talking about representation and memory and how we teach and think about the history of Black women has really been on my mind and on the minds of my students through this whole semester. So I thought I would talk a little bit about what we've been working on through this strange academic time. And so one of the ways that I've approached this class is, as you were mentioning, we have a lot of future history teachers in our program, both students who are history majors and students who are preparing to become social science teacher preparation courses. So we really think about that when I'm teaching a class like the civil rights history, because it's really very, very popular with the future teachers. And so we think about how to frame this through the idea of both the students reflecting on how they have been taught about the civil rights movement and how they, as future teachers, want to frame this history in their own classrooms going forward. And one of the books that we're using is actually called the Uses and Misuses of the Civil Rights Movement. So we're really thinking a lot about this idea of memory, who's remembered, whose stories are foregrounded, and particularly what that means for us in this present moment and for us, our society going forward, whose voices are out there. And this idea that you referenced that Vice President Harris talked about, that Black women's contributions in this movement, in many places in the movement, as Dr. Taylor was talking about, have not always been brought to the foreground. In a lot of popular history of the civil rights movement, and now my children are in school and I'm seeing what they're learning. Some of it is very much, you see the popular history of the Southern segregation struggle. And if women are mentioned, it's usually in a kind of a passing way. It's a Rosa Parks, or it's, a brief story that is hard to really get a grip of the really important role that women had in the movement. And so some of the things we've been doing this semester have been aimed at both looking at popular representations of the movement and having students really kind of critically examine those for, where are the Black women, where is their story? And if it's not there, whose story is being represented? And then at the same time, obviously building on just so much wealth of amazing historical scholarship on the contributions of Black women in the movement, and having them read about that or learn about that. And so what they've been working on is this kind of project that I'm excited to see how it turns out. I have the final things coming in a couple of weeks, but we've been watching the whole, or almost the whole, Eyes on the Prize documentary series, which is fantastic for so many ways, as still the kind of most profound statement and record of the movement. But definitely one of the things that my students have identified as missing is often the role of women in this story. And so they have the opportunity this semester, their group project is to propose a new history, a new documentary proposal, which they're kind of having fun with, but they're also a little bit confused by. They're used to just writing essays. And so now they're writing like pitch documents. We're imagining that we can go, pitch the Obama's production company and with a new show. And several of the groups, I've been really excited to see, several of the groups have proposed that what they'd really like to see are more perspectives from the perspective of women. So I thought I'd share with you some of their proposals. And one of them says, the civil rights movement often focuses only on the men of the movement. Behind the spotlights, though, hidden in the shadows, remain incredible women that work tirelessly to build and organize the protests, boycotts, and marches that help move and inspire a nation and its people. So it's this idea that, this is a story that's really important to be told. And so I think they've been really enjoying learning about all these different kinds of women. We've been reading biographies of important leaders like Ella Baker, but also, having them learn more complicated histories of people they may have already heard about. For example, some of the biographies about Rosa Parks, but they've also learned a lot about the contributions of women that they had never heard the names of, the people who worked behind the scenes, like Vice President Harris was talking about, the people who were really the backbone of the movement, coming from a lot of the same organizations that Dr. Taylor was talking about, coming from Black women's church auxiliaries and, and the different groups that existed that, the movement could tap into these existing networks of women, school teachers who led the Montgomery bus boycott, for example, just lots of places where women really put the movement on their shoulders, as I think is one of the metaphors that's often used. So this week, they're going to be pulling this all together to talk about why this is so important, why a history of the civil rights movement and a history really of any history that doesn't include Black women is misrepresenting what happened in the past, which is problematic in and of itself, obviously. But for them, what's really resonating with them is the idea that this misshapes how we look at our contemporary society. And for many of them who were really kind of awoken, I guess, by the protests of last summer, they see that they are making those connections between the way that people looked for male leaders, and they're always looking for who's in charge, and they don't connect the idea that women lead or led in the past. And so I'm really excited to see the discussion that we're going to have in our final weeks.
Absolutely. That sounds like such a wonderful and rich project. And I think it's important, yes, that students are able to engage creativity, in addition to writing essays and doing deep research, or combining all of those to create these proposals. As you were talking and thinking about Eyes on the Prize, I'm always drawn to Julian Bond's whole idea around how the civil rights movement is taught, that master narrative, which is simplified and really diminishes the role and importance of women. And Dr. Taylor, I know that you had suggested some readings on Rosa Parks, and Dr. Chilton, I'm so happy that you mentioned Rosa Parks, because I think that certainly as we're looking at how the civil rights movement or Black history is taught, Rosa Parks' role and her long history of leadership and activism is often, not articulated or remembered. And I think that that's really important. I'll just also say that I have great hope listening to what your students are doing, future teachers who are going to be in classrooms. Dr. Taylor or Mr. Broxton, would you like to weigh in here?
Sure. One of the things that I always find so interesting is that when we think about people like Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, up until recently, I would say maybe the last decade, most of the books are reduced to juvenile literature, children's books. So we don't see, up until like maybe the last 10 years, there haven't been academic scholarly biographies of these iconic women. And I always found it interesting that they could be reduced exclusively to juvenile literature. So this is why usually people would, they did their book report on Rosa Parks in the 6th grade, right? They did their other book report on Harriet Tubman. And now, I would say maybe the last decade, Black women's historians, right, have really teased out the complexity of these iconic women's activism. So, some of the more recent biographies of Rosa Parks, and I'm sure Catherine can jump in, they talk about how, she was a secretary with the local NAACP. She, during the Montgomery bus boycott itself, she, got in a truck with someone and rode to other cities in Alabama and bought up all of the bicycles that she could and brought them back to Montgomery so Black men could ride bicycles to get to work, because not everybody could participate in the carpool, right? So in many ways, they talk about, that Rosa Parks had a long history of activism. And on the day that she didn't get out of her seat, right, that was one of many days that she had engaged in certain kinds of protests. But actually, it's taken the field of Black women's history to take these women outside of juvenile literature.
Such an important point. I'm going to pivot just a little bit here and kind of explore and examine the importance of other places outside of either the academy or classrooms. And we know that museums and cultural centers and libraries, of course, are vital centers of learning, particularly as it relates to the experiences, contributions, and perspectives of people who have been historically marginalized. Mr. Broxton, I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about your work at the Museum of the African Diaspora, and in particular, how have recent exhibits, the focus of the museum, and your educational outreach helped elevate the personal lived experiences of Black women?
Yeah, again, I want to start off by saying thank you for having me. This is an amazing group, and I'm so impressed by this conversation and excited for it. I think I want to follow Dr. Chilton's example and kind of talk about what we've been doing over this last year. So, I think also to backtrack a little bit, if folks haven't been to Museum of the African Diaspora, we rebranded in 2014 as a contemporary art museum. And so, if you had visited Moad prior to that, it was a very history-centered museum. During this pandemic, though, we've had an opportunity with sheltering in place. We didn't have access to our temporary exhibitions. The museum is not a collecting institution. So, unlike many museums, we can't go into the collection and deep dive into a painting or a sculpture or a performance piece or something like that. So, what we've actually been doing is kind of spearheaded by my colleague Sade Gabreus, who runs the docent program, has been going through publicly available archives. And so through this process, we've curated these exhibitions and these biweekly programs called Art as We See It. And so it's just really looking at these archives. And one of the things that has really come out of um, mining the archives is, much, and I'm really just echoing what Eula and Catherine both said, is really that women really pop up prominently, and in a lot of photographs, you'll look at a hero figure such as W.E.B. Du Bois, and, you'll see the wife by his side. And a lot of times the images look like these women are, just standing by their man and supporting them. But as you start to deep dive into their history, you start to find out that these women wielded tons and tons of power. And so, kind of one of the most interesting things over this last year is that we've really been focusing on highlighting the everyday women. So, we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about Rosa Parks, we talk about, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., but we, often don't talk about these women who were really moving, you know, who had to be instrumental in organizing things like the Montgomery bus boycott. And so again, I'm just echoing things, but some of the other things that we talk about are, for an example, is just bringing it locally to Oakland, to the Bay Area. A popular figure, William Shorey, who was the West Coast's only Black whaler. Um, in history, the entire West Coast history. And so there's this really famous photograph of him that, is even woven into a tapestry that the Oakland Museum has. And he's got this beautiful family, and no one looks at his wife, Julia Ann, besides her being beautiful. As you start to look into her history, you start to find out that she was an organizer. She was involved in women's organizations. She was involved in starting churches and, really being instrumental and be not just behind the scenes, really at the forefront and using her family's influence to make things happen. We talk about the Columbia World's Expo, and Frederick Douglass comes to the top of a conversation like that. But, Ida B. Wells was someone who was instrumental in that. So, just really looking at these archives that anyone can look at and unearthing the photographs of these Black women who were really the power, behind all of these icons that we have.
Gosh, in my mind, I'm already thinking about now what I want to research and learn more about after you sharing some of these individuals and their stories. Can you give us a little bit of information if people would be interested in exploring these resources, or what's happening with the museum right now in terms of folks visiting and connecting?
Well, we're still closed. We're going to be closed until the fall.
Okay.
We've decided to take this opportunity to redesign the museum, to make some extra space so folks can see us online. And I think when you start to move programs online, we're starting to see that our audience members are coming from not only all over the country, but all over the world. And then again, you start to get these more complicated perspectives. You start to see that, if I'm talking about a historically significant moment, chances are very high that someone who's joined the program was personally involved in it and has additional insight. And so, I think it's really been a time to truly democratize the way that museums operate. And, folks know museums have had a reckoning in this last year. A very prominent museum in San Francisco in particular has had a very public reckoning. And so even a museum like, MOAD that focuses on Black culture and art and life, we're having our own personal reckoning to think about, which narratives are we, not including. And so it's, it's been really an opportunity to expand the stories that we tell.
Well, that's incredibly challenging work. That's necessary work. That's exciting work. We'll be excited to kind of continue to engage and connect with the museum and see what is shared and produced. And I love your point about some of the benefits of moving online and how that has figuratively opened your doors to folks that might not have connected with the museum. I wonder if our scholars would like to say anything about some of these histories that Dimitri brought to us, or if there was anything there that you wanted to add.
Well, I love the story about the whaler, right?
Me too.
It's just like so doubly awesome. And the fact that you all have figured out his wife was, just as incredible and interesting. And when you were talking, it reminded me of this article by Charles Payne, The Men Led, but the Women Organized. Because in many ways, it gets at that behind the scenes happening, the fact that you don't see a lot of women in these kind of quote, traditional leadership positions, but they are working. They are, as the young people say, grinding, right? To make things happen in their lives as well as their families' lives. So I just really appreciated, you guys taking the extra step to say, here's a picture of a beautiful family. Let's try to find out a little bit more about them beyond him and his extraordinary experiences. So I appreciate that.
That's great. And Eula, I'm so happy that you brought up Charles Payne. I've Got the Light of Freedom is one of the most important books I've ever read, and I think I can't recommend it enough. And such an important voice and scholar. And yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And he was the historian that early on, prior to the last decade, he was really interested and invested in Southern history, women's history. And I think he was also really invested in trying to shake up the binary that I think in some ways has been anchored by the Eyes on the Prize videos. Mm-hmm. So I love it, Catherine, that you're using it in the classroom, because I too assign it. It's just a wonderful documentary history. But what this history also does is that it creates this dichotomy between Northerners and Southerners, that Southerners were nonviolent, and nonviolent direct action. And then Black power happens in the North, where you have a certain kind of resistance. And so, while it's a wonderful teaching tool, it does help to kind of like anchor, certain notions of this modern civil rights struggle or this freedom struggle period.
Mm-hmm. It truly is nuanced and complex, and I think that's really critical for us to be reminded of. Well, as we're talking certainly about documentaries, and obviously we've already had some time thinking about Shirley Chisholm. We've seen some, this sort of wave of recently released documentaries and films that have presented the stories and experiences of women like Fannie Lou Hamer, like Shirley Chisholm, and Margaret Sloan Hunter. I'm hoping that all of you, or whoever wants to take the lead here, would comment on this awakened interest in the experiences of these women. Dr. Taylor, you've talked about sort of the sort of focus in juvenile writing and juvenile books, and not in terms of academic scholarship, minus the last 10 years. But I'm interested in your comments on the awakened interest in the experiences of these women. And then Whose stories are still missing?
Gosh, we are, this is where social media, right, is so important. And, I think what's so interesting is that during this COVID moment, right, people have watched so many documentaries, so many series. It's like we have gobbled up information in ways that I don't think we have ever as a society. And I think this is that, people interested in these Black women organizers, Black iconic women of women's history. I think it was kind of like a natural evolution in the larger gobbling up of media to a certain degree. But I also think, during this Black Lives Matter moment, people are searching for role models. People are searching for instruction. So you'll see young women wearing t-shirts, Asada taught me, right? This whole idea that, they are looking for contemporary in terms of the 60s, right? Women that they can identify with, women that they can go back, read their work, so that they don't have to reinvent a wheel of activism. So on the one hand, it is about, finding more representation, right, in the larger scale of history. But I think a lot of it has to do with young people grappling for guidance and instruction so that they don't have to reinvent a wheel in terms of their own activism. And also recognize that they are standing on the shoulders of other women. And so they can draw inspiration and courage, because it took courage for these women in the 60s and the 70s to do the kind of work that they did, just the way in which it takes courage for these young people to be in the streets. Yeah. And so I think that, it's only natural to want to understand legacy and linkages, and to understand how we got at this particular moment, what came before it, so that we can imagine and visualize something totally different, something totally empowering. I think one of the things that Shirley Chisholm said during her campaign was that, anything that's racist is anti-human. So she was talking about, human rights. How can we treat each other in ways that require one to always respect what everyone is bringing to the table. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I'd love to echo what Dr. Taylor's saying about role models, and kind of, I really like that idea of people searching for stories that they can connect with. And I definitely have seen that with my students who are, mostly college age, younger students. And I think the stories of Black women that they've been really interested in have been of young women, high school, college women, and really seeing the way that leaders don't have to be quote unquote old. I always like the way they describe Martin Luther King as being old when he was really like in his 30s most of the time. But the very young women, stories like people like Barbara Johns, who was actually, like 15, 16 when she led a boycott of her school in 1951. So, a story that most people don't know about, but when my students learned that, she was the one who pushed this, and her fellow students helped push the NAACP into taking on their case. And their case was actually one of the ones that became Brown versus Board of Education. So it's this way that, young people have always been pushing, and then they always get pushed back, right? They always get pushed back from people saying like, you're doing too much, you're pushing too hard. But they definitely, I think, have really resonated with this idea that young women have been leading the movement for a really long time. Young Black and Latino women have been at the forefront of the struggle. And that's not a new thing. That's, I think, as Dr. Sale said, that's standing on previous generations' shoulders and kind of taking on that mantle. So I really, I see that in the way that they've connected.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think also, to just kind of add on that, going back to I'm just such a fan of looking at everyday people as heroes and sheroes. And so, for me, I think the question is about like thinking about it locally. So just thinking about folks like the Black Rosie the Riveters that are still not really spoken about. And so these are everyday women who came from the South and, powered our war efforts. And, while their men in their lives were overseas in Europe, fighting for freedom back at home, they were fighting for freedom here while also raising children. And, so I think there's a film, the Invisible Heroes film, I believe is what it's called, that looks at the Black Rosie the Riveters and, thinking about this history that's local. There is the Rosie the Riveter monument, but, when we see the photograph of the Rosie the Riveter, it's a white woman with blue eyes. And so, oftentimes as a person of color, a student of color, you don't see yourself reflected. And so, I really think it's important that, that we show heroes and sheroes as everyday people, just like also showing the young people so that folks feel like it's not accessible. I don't have to be this superhuman person that doesn't sleep, eat, or have any desires in my life. I can be this everyday person and I can actually spark a movement, even thinking about, the women who organized to free Huey Newton, and that we think about locally, we think about Huey Newton as the leader of the Black Panther Party. You may throw in and Angela Davis, who was instrumental and amazing, but there was all of these everyday women who were, powering the protest, feeding everyone, packing the lunches, and so I think it's important that we also tell those stories, so that we, young folks don't think that Huey Newton just came up by himself and created this party and made all these things happen by himself.
No, and so many important points there, and I appreciate everything that was shared. I think Dimitri, your focus on ensuring that we are thinking about and amplifying the stories of the people who were living their life courageously and doing all of the things that I think a lot of us can connect with. I love the idea of a model and how that has really served our contemporary activists during this particular moment. And I think that it's been really exciting for me too, that as we are exploring issues and talking about anti-racism, that people like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde are also being elevated, that this is not a new concept. And in fact, this was written about, discussed, shared by Black women. And I think that's a really critical part of all of it too. So I thank all of you for this. I think this kind of came to a moment for me when I saw that Target had sold out of their t-shirt that had Fannie Lou, Ella, Sojourner. And it was like, wow, here we are in this moment. It's something to consider. I want to, you all have brought up so many really wonderful examples. And as we are reflecting and honoring the tremendous contributions of Black women in political spaces and in everyday life, in communities, is there a particular individual who inspires you? And if you could talk a little bit about why and what we might learn from her example.
I want to kind of jump in, I guess, and just say, I think lately the media has made her a little less popular, or I don't know. I don't know the word that I'm looking for, but anyway, the person that really inspires me is Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and I just think, just from the beginning of my awareness of her, when you know, the election with Gore and Bush, when she came out and still called Gore Mr. President, I think, just her unflinching, um, just her love and support and tirelessly working for African American people and speaking up in the face of, injustice and, just being, folks call her Auntie Maxine, and it's because she reminds us of a family member that we all have, that just tells it like it is. And you may not like it when she says it, but you know that it's true and you know you're going to learn something from it. So I just think, the way that she is an older person, at this point, but she still inspires so many young people that, especially as an African American, that the idea that you don't have to code switch to be successful. And I think she's someone who we don't talk about her story as, someone who moved to LA and, worked in garments. I think she was a seamstress first, and then, she was someone's typing clerk, and then decides that, she wants more for her life, and then enrolls herself in school. And, she's a self-made woman. And so just again, going back to that whole story of her very humble roots, and now she's, this icon that's on posters and is memeified everywhere. She makes me smile, and she makes me feel like, there's a politician that can say what I'm thinking, but don't have the power to say, on the platform that she has.
Thank you, Dimitri. Yes. I love our Eric Thomas. He's a writer. He writes for Harper's Bazaar, and he's has a very large social media presence. And he has written extensively about Maxine Waters. And I feel like, yes, to your point, there's certainly very specific feelings about her and about her, what she's done politically, and but I think also she's continuing to have this moment, and truly is such an inspiring and iconic figure. I think it's a great person to put focus on. Kate or Eula, anybody that's coming to mind that provides inspiration?
Sure. This is always awkward when you have to say, like, who's unmuting? I don't want to go over the top with somebody, but I was thinking about this question, and I thought about somebody who I've been able to not really meet, but be in the same room with a couple of times in recent years, whose name is Judy Richardson. And I think she's really inspired the way that I've approached this class. She was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC group. And I've seen her on panels a number of times in recent years. She's been promoting this incredible work that she's been doing. And Dimitri may already have come across this, and when you've been mining for photographs, but she's been working with a team of archivists and historians to catalog and preserve and digitize the history of SNCC, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And as a historian and as a teacher, it's just so important to be able to have those materials and to be able to share them with students, and for my students who are future teachers to think about how they can use those materials. And really the way that she talked about the goal of this project that they've been doing is to bring this fuller vision of the civil rights movement to more people. And so that's really inspiring. But also just sort of when she talks a little about how she got into this, she became kind of the unofficial archivist and historian of the movement because the day she walked into the SNCC office, they found out that she could type incredibly fast, and so she became the secretary. Right, that's a very common story that we've been hearing. But she became this powerhouse behind the scenes and realized that her job, although not love, she certainly didn't love being the person who was always asked to take the minutes. And she and other women organized and sat in and protested the fact that they were always asked to make the coffee and take the notes. But she became this very important sort of, I think, keeper of the history and keeper of the movement. And she was also, we've been talking about it a lot tonight, was one of the executive producers of Eyes on the Prize. So she's just been kind of this ongoing voice of the movement. But I just really love this. It's called the SNCC Digital Gateway Project.
Yeah.
I would really encourage people to check out, just in terms of, really being able to see through those documents the way that women were, half of the student volunteers, they were half of the activists, and that they were doing really important work, even if sometimes the male members didn't always acknowledge that. So I just wanted to I've sort of been very inspired and thankful in terms of thinking about what she's done and what her and her colleagues have accomplished with this project.
Oh, I love the SNCC Digital Gateway. I'm so happy that you brought that up. And I love that you can go there and explore. One of the pieces of that website and the collection too that I think is so important is the focus on certainly Fannie Lou Hamer and Bernice Reagan and other freedom singers, and giving students an opportunity to really not only learn about the importance of music in the movement, but read the lyrics and listen to recordings and be able to really thoughtfully consider what these moments in song meant in terms of comfort, but also in terms of inspiration. Oh, I love the SNCC Digital Gateway. Thank you for bringing that up. Eula, somebody that is inspiring for you, although you've mentioned so many amazing women.
I'm also inspired by Maxine Waters, I have to tell you. And when you were talking, Dimitri, I started smiling as well. There is something about the familiar, right? Something about when you can identify with someone as family in a particular kind of way. So I agree with you there. I think for me, the person that I'm most inspired by is a person that I'm actually working on a memoir with. And her name is Frances Beale. And Frances Beale wrote this essay, Double Jeopardy: To Be Black and Female. And it becomes this foundational essay where this whole idea that Black women shouldn't have to choose or to break apart who they are in terms of their identity to be a part of the struggle. So Fran Beale, she has such an amazing organizing history. She is an organizer. So she was a co-founder of the Third World Women's Alliance. She was a member of SNCC in New York. She continues to be active. Let me just tell you that. She lives here in Oakland. I met her through the Black Radical Congress, which was an organization that came into existence under the leadership of Manning Marable at Columbia University. But she's done all kinds of things. So like, for example, when South Africa had the election, the first election, she went to South Africa and was one of the observers, so there's nothing she doesn't, how can I say, she has her hands in local politics, local organizing efforts, as well as these larger political organizations that have a history. And so I find her intriguing because, like many of the women during this time period, she found her feminist spirit in the midst of being married and a mother and not having a supportive partner and trying to figure it all out in the 50s and the 60s. And so her feminism was an evolution of how she was living, trying to figure out. And at one point she said, I realized I wasn't depressed, I was being oppressed. Okay, so
yeah.
And so just kind of navigating, this world. And she found, and so in many ways, her feminism was a way to figure out, how can my daughters have a different life? How can they not be so invested in patriarchy? How can, so, she raised really, really hard-hitting questions that I think many people continue to negotiate and navigate today. So for me, it's Frances Beale.
Oh my gosh. And we will be very excited to learn more about your memoir writing. And I bet that is such an exciting and fascinating and nourishing project. And I think that there's so much there to think about too, in terms of our lived identities and what we are socialized to believe, what, like you said, what we navigate in terms of whether it be patriarchal structures, or what have you. That is fascinating. I cannot wait to learn more about her. So thank you. Again, we've had so many great resources shared tonight, but I'm hoping that before we move into our audience Q&A, if any of you would like to share, certainly Dr. Taylor, you've just shared one of the projects you're working on, but are there projects or exhibits, research that you are constructing or involved in that amplify the work of Black women? I know that we're putting together a reading list, as well as a list that includes documentaries and podcasts for our audience. But if you have any recommendations for our audience for further learning.
Well, I'll just throw in a couple of them, just thinking about the arts in particular. And so I think an amazing local organization is See Black Women, where the E at the end of women is an X. So just checking out the work of those amazing local women, which Lava Thomas is one of the members of the group. And also I encourage folks to just check out her project on the mugshot portraits of the women of the Montgomery bus boycott. So to bring it back to that, where she does highlight Rosa Parks, but all of the other women, and the way that she captures their portraits is just phenomenal. It's amazing. And she also had an opportunity to speak with them. So this is a way to not just take in this information through literature or a film, but also just through the visual arts. And then I guess also to highlight someone that we've also worked with, I think Chantrell P. Lewis, her documentary that was just released this last week on Netflix. I want to say it's on Friday. In Our Mother's Gardens. So again, to just bring it back to the everyday women and the influence that they've had, and some of it's not an in-depth historical film, but you do get the sense of the role that Black women have played with in their daughters or their granddaughters' lives that made them who they are. And so some of the folks in that film are like Tarana Burke, for example. So really important, prominent women that have been mentioned on this panel, and just kind of hearing some of their origin stories and how women shaped them.
Oh, I love the reminder about the arts and what we can learn. My gosh, the pictures from the Montgomery bus boycott sounds really interesting. I really, with students, always loved looking at the Freedom Riders when they were arrested, and those pictures and having conversations. And I am excited about that documentary too on Netflix, Dimitri. I have to say that one of the most impactful moments that I had at MOAD many years ago was a lecture about Black women and cooking, and there were several, there were authors, historians, and chefs, and it was truly an event for all senses. I mean, they were cooking, they were lecturing. It was amazing, and I think as we're thinking about sort of our homes, gardens, cooking, those are really rich places to think and to explore as well. Great recommendations. Kate and Eula, do you want to share about some of the projects you're doing or things that our audience might be interested in knowing more about? You're both immersed in grading at the end of the semester, I know.
Well, I feel like I kind of, shared mine in terms of
great.
Bill. So yeah, I'm just going to leave it with Fran.
I think that's great. We can't wait to learn more about your research and work and memoir writing.
Yeah, well, definitely grading is coming like a freight train in the next couple of days. But I guess we've talked a lot about the 20th century today, and especially I think I've been very much anchored there because of my work teaching the civil rights movement this semester. But at my research, actually, I write more about the 19th century. And that's definitely in the last, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years, has seen a very similar, I think, evolution in terms of talking about the inclusion of Black women's contribution, and especially sort of reframing the resistant activism of women as not as complementary to, maybe different from, but not less than the similar actions of men. And so I'm really, really excited that I'm going to be part of a new collection edited by Karen Cook Bell that's coming out next year. And it's, I think, currently titled Black Women's Struggles During the Civil War and Reconstruction. So that's going to be really great. It's going to bring together, I think we have like 6 or 7 different authors around different places in Southern history, and just really exploring what women went through during those time periods, and how, you know, women were struggling to find, you know, new jobs and families and put their lives back together. And so I'm going to be writing about the District of Columbia and this project that I worked on a couple of years ago, where I spent a long time tracing the post-war histories of women using Ancestry.com and trying to figure out what women did after the war. Because I came across a lot of genealogists when I was working in the archives, and they were all trying to find the names of people in the archival records. So I started thinking that maybe I could do it backwards. And so then I started trying to find the names of people that I knew I had in the records in Ancestry.com. So I got quite good at doing that kind of research. It's really interesting to try and track down a particular person and figure out whether you've got the right person. But really, a lot of what we're talking about in that volume is just, you know, how what women went through is different, but without their story. I mean, it's very much an echo of what we're talking about today. Without their story, we're not getting the full picture of what that period was really about. So that's going to be some work coming up in the next few months. But just like Dr. Taylor, I'm really excited that, you know, for when we get to share that with more people.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. And I'm so intrigued by the Ancestry.com piece. I guess in my mind would imagine that that might be, I don't know, either like diminished or not seen as a valuable or vital resource. And you clearly were able to engage it to really find out some very important information. Oh, that's great. Well, I'm gonna, as we're looking at our time, I'm actually gonna move us into some of our audience questions that have come into the Q&A. And I think, Kate, to what you were just talking about in terms of your interests and research, we have a question. How important is archaeology and anthropology in studying African-American women's history and art, where written records are sparse? Our asker says, especially for the 19th century Congo, he's reading King Leopold's Ghost. But I think that also holds up, you know, in other spaces and places. How important are these other disciplines in studying this history?
I would probably kick that one over to Dimitri as more of an expert in art field. It's not something. It's a really good question, but especially, I don't personally know too much about archaeology, anthropology, but I would say that certainly excavating the history of Black women in the 19th century requires embracing all kinds of methodologies, because these are histories that are more difficult to find and often have to be more creative to piece together and to kind of think about where you might find evidence and what that evidence is showing you. So definitely being able to bring in the built environment and artifacts and other pieces, I think is absolutely really critical in United States history, and I'm assuming you know, all over the world. But I have not had the opportunity to do that kind of thing myself, although it sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, that is definitely not my area of expertise. I'm very much an art history person, but you know, I know the role of archaeology in complicating or adding to stories. You know, for example, the thing that comes up to me is, I believe it was last week. I'm very stuck on things that have just happened, but I believe it was last week or the week before where archaeologists discovered or rediscovered Harriet Tubman's childhood home. And so the artifacts that they were able to find, give a clue into her early life that is not spoken about. And then she also went back and, lived at her family farm, which I think is now smack in the middle of a national park. And no one could identify, where she grew up. And now, they are. And, unfortunately, it's being given away to the sea. So they're scrambling to collect the artifacts to tell a more, full story of her life than, and I think, again, like Eula said, going away from the juvenile literature to tell this, much more complicated story of her life.
I think I would add the African burial ground in New York City. So I don't. Everyone is shaking their head. Remember that? So when the African burial ground it was a colonial cemetery in New York City, and when the government was going to put a post office on the location, they had it in the records that there was a quote Negro burial ground, but it had been just kind of like ignored and just kind of like mapped and remapped. Well, eventually, during this last, during the 80s, I believe it was, once again, it was exposed, but this time there was enough community folk, along with Howard University. We haven't talked about the role of historically Black colleges in training many of these women, but they came together and said, wait a minute, these are our ancestors. We just, we have to figure out what to do with their remains. And so many of the skeletal remains were brought to actually Howard University, where they were, they underwent all of the technological ways of evaluating bones. And from the remains, the history of slavery becomes even, I guess, more real, if you will, because of the bones revealed that, the weight that women carried on their heads, how it had impacted their skeletal remains, how many children were buried with their mothers, how, at least a third of the burial ground are infants. So this high infant mortality rate during the institution of slavery. So I think that I think that the remains are still being evaluated, even though the leading professor left Howard and went to Maryland, but the University of Maryland, I'm not quite sure. But all that is to say that I think when you look at the African burial ground in New York City, you get even more information about the horrors of slavery and what slavery actually did to the physical body.
So important. And I think that it gives us a whole other dimension to really think about and explore and consider in terms of really understanding the complex history and drawing it to the body and drawing it to the artwork or art that it was created. All of that just really important. I'm going to pivot to another question here. It's been an interesting, I would say, 3 weeks. We have seen legislation passed in several states that state very clearly that curriculum that either engages an anti-racist or critical race theory mentions that in the curriculum will not be allowed. We also have seen tremendous resistance to curriculum like the New York Times 1619 Project. And as this is all happening, Eula, to your point about this Black Lives Matter moment, it's a really interesting kind of place to sort of sit and observe how this is all manifesting. The question is, do you all think that we are moving toward a country where history classes will be very different based on where one lives regionally? And then I guess I would be interested in how do we avoid that?
Well, I think, just to start that off as I believe that curriculum and the way that we teach history is already different. So that's not something that's going to be,
No.
forthcoming. I think California has moved to now we have, ethnic studies across the whole state as being adopted. San Francisco has just recently voted to pass African studies or African American studies for students across all grades. And so, that's definitely not something that's happening in a state like Texas, for example. They're not planning to integrate those. So I think we will definitely have differences. And I think when you just look at the national standards, the Common Core standards, they're so broad that, as a school district can choose to implement them however they want to, which is, I think, better than when I was in school and you had to learn these facts that then later you go to college and you realize everything that you were taught was false and you have to, deconstruct it. But, I think, so there is a benefit to being able to use multiple resources for a teacher to teach a subject and to address, the founding of America, for example. And so I think the way that they're go about it, through this Black Lives Matter, I think that people are resistant to change. And I think in places where, folks don't think that they're racist, they just think that, that there is a such thing as separate, but, separate and equal still exist. I think, yeah, they're just going to continue to teach it the way that they want to, because
Mhm.
this moment that we've been in this last year is where folks really have to contend with history. They have to contend with inequities. They have to contend with privilege that still exists. And I think those things make people afraid. And teachers are not exempt from that, and school districts are not exempt from that. So, yeah, I think unless the Department of Education comes down, which is never going to happen, and says we must teach, the history of oppression in this country, and Zen's history becomes a textbook that's universally accepted. I think it's going to be different, state by state and even city by city.
I
Thank
totally
you.
agree with you, Dimitri.
Kate, with your students who are future teachers, have you had conversations about this resistance? I work in curriculum, and Dimitri, your point about very different standards and frameworks. Proud that California has a really progressive history social science framework that continues to be more inclusive and more representative, but that's certainly not the case. Kate, have you had these conversations with your students and how they might be contending with these realities?
I think for the most part, our students are preparing to become teachers in California. So they're
Mhm.
very much embracing this. And I think that's where the enthusiasm that students
Yeah.
have for classes like this civil rights history class is coming from, is that they know they're going to have to teach these subjects, and they want to be able to teach them from a place of real knowledge and understanding, because these are really difficult concepts, right? Teaching hard history, that's what we call it. And they do want to feel really confident when they walk into a classroom and have to talk about race, that they feel prepared to do so. And they're doing it from a background of just like a real historical understanding, and not, I did this in one class one time, right? They really want to know that. But I think they're also, we're part of the biggest public university system in the country, between, my students and Dr. Taylor's students. That's a lot of students that are being exposed to this kind of history, and to Dimitri's point that this is kind of already the way that education has been bifurcated, I think. But California is a really big state and a really big market and a really big creator of people with knowledge. So I think they will go forth and do really great things.
Mhm. Thank you. Well, we are getting toward the end of our program, and I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to do some final sharing of thoughts about Black women, about the certainly rich and important, compelling and inspiring history that we've talked about, but also perhaps even speak to what you see as the future for Black female leadership as well. So I'll go ahead and open it to all of you.
Well, I guess I'll start. I think that when this has, first of all, been a wonderful conversation, very inspiring in terms of how we're thinking about Black women's history. But I have to say that I've also been thinking about the challenges that the women had during that time period, and that these comparable challenges will more than likely continue to follow us in the coming years. And I was reading a little bit about Shirley Chisholm before our conversation, so that I could just kind of, remind myself who she was. And I had a student that wrote a dissertation around comedy. And Shirley Chisholm, during her campaign, became fodder for many comics. People talked about her hair. This is why she began to wear wigs all the time, and you no longer saw her hair. People talked about her teeth. People talked about her color. And if we fast forward to 2021, questions about color and hair and body type continue to mark how Black women are read, how Black women are understood as different or acceptable, who can be brought into a circle, who is still on the periphery. And so I think the embodiment of, or the embodiment of a Black female body and all of the elements of it can continue to be used against Black women in anti-feminine ways. I was even thinking about how Michelle Obama was constantly critiqued in the White House, right? Even with the election of Donald Trump and Melania as the new First Lady, I remember a woman was fired because she said, I'm so glad that I will no longer have to look at an ape in heels," referring to Michelle Obama. So all that is to say that, the intellect and the organizing has always been there, will continue to be there in my experience, because of the necessity to change the world that is not of our making, right? Okay, so that is evident. At the same time, the history of femininity, masculinity, and marking bodies in gender-specific ways as a way in which to distance people from certain kind of human elements, I think continues to haunt Black womanhood.
I really deeply appreciate all of those points, and the powerful reminder that the work is ongoing, and there's still tremendous work left to do. And as it relates to Black women and bodies specifically, I'm also reminded of where and when and how do trans women enter into this, queer women, differently abled women. There's a lot for us to continue to consider and think about as we seek to make spaces as welcoming and inclusive and elevating of Black women. Thank you for all of that.
And Meg, I so appreciate you raising Black trans women, because Black trans women are the ones that are being murdered at disproportionate numbers when we look at the number of people who are being murdered. So they are the prime targets of violence.
And what I find interesting in connecting to our previous points that we made about the inspiration that people are finding from the activists of generations past, Black trans women have always been at the front lines, if you will, doing the work, and yet, you know, continue to be victims of horrifying violence at rates that should awaken all of us. And so I think that there's just, again, there's so much work for us to do, and to continue being invested in. Kate and Dimitri, would you like to share anything else with our audience before we close out our program tonight?
I'd just really like to also say thank you to you and to the library for bringing us together for this really important conversation at this moment, that we can share our thoughts. And I'll be really interested to be able to go back and share them with my class and with future classes, and to really very much keep this in mind, keep that challenge in mind of always making sure that the contribution of Black women is being centered, but also investigated, you know, thoroughly in these classes, which is always a challenge given the scope of the things we have to do, and, you know, the mountains we have to move every semester. But it's really important work, and it will go on.
Thank you, Kate.
I echo that sentiment. This has been a really inspiring conversation. I'm just really glad to be a part of this. You know, and I was a little skeptical at first as someone who does not identify as a woman. But, you know, I think Dr. Chilton and Dr. Taylor are amazing, and I'm just really glad to be in company with you.
Well, I am very appreciative, and it's been an honor to be in space with all of you. And I also want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. Before we officially close out, I just want to give a reminder that if you have enjoyed tonight's program and look forward to more, we invite you to make a gift to the Library Foundation. You can visit the Library Foundation's website, or you can click the link in the chat box, and please know that your gift absolutely makes a difference. I also want to invite everybody who is with us to return for next month's Live from the Library program. I personally am very excited about it. The program is Why We Swim with author Bonnie Choi, who is local to the San Francisco Bay Area, is on June the 9th. Bonnie will detail the evolution of human swimming from learning for survival to testing our limits, and she will also highlight swimmers from around the world. There's more information about this program, and the registration link can be found on the Walnut Creek Library Foundation website. I want to thank you all again for attending, and I hope that we can continue to show up boldly and elevate and amplify these stories, narratives, experiences, and really valuable contributions of Black women. Thank you so much. Good night.